What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to talk about Horizon Zero Dawn. I talked about it a bunch in my last video, and I basically was just saying how much I thought is a really good game. And it is. It's a little bit unfortunate that it came out like right before Breath of the Wild did, so I feel like Horizon Zero Dawn, despite getting a lot of positive press, it's kind of living in Zelda's shadow at the moment, and to me that's pretty unfortunate because it is a really good game. So hopefully talking about it a little bit lets me shed a little bit, even just a little bit more light on it than it's currently getting, because it deserves it. So I want to kind of go and talk about it in more depth than my last video and more or less review the game. So Horizon Zero Dawn is the 7th game from Guerrilla Games, who, if you haven't played Killzone, you probably don't know who they are, because 5 of their other 6 titles over the past 13 years have all been Killzone titles. So these are the Killzone guys, and this is a not Killzone title. It's very, very different from Killzone. At least I assume. I don't claim to have a lot of experience with Killzone, so I don't know these developers really, but so Zero Dawn is very much like a Far Cry game. At least I look at it as being pretty similar to Far Cry Primal. I haven't played any of the Far Cry games, so I can't make a direct comparison, but in Zero Dawn it's an open world game, third person game. You're running around, you're collecting things, crafting things, climbing watchtowers. The biggest difference is that you basically take most of the animals and you turn them into killer robot dinosaur things. And you've got Horizon Zero Dawn. So one of the big things that I think sets this game apart from the average third-person shooter is the fact that a lot of focus is put on the bow. Aloy is portrayed as being a bow-wielding character. I didn't even realize until I started playing the game that she even has other weapons. But it kind of touches a lot of different parts of the game, I would say. So one of the main obvious differences between using a bow and using guns in your average shooting game is the fact that the bow is just a lot slower. You're reloading every shot, and every shot you have to, it's every single shot that you do, you have to knock the arrow, you have to pull the arrow, and you have to loose the arrow. So it takes a lot longer to do a single shot. And that kind of pushes the game in a much slower, more calculated direction. And you can kind of see that just in the way the combat takes place, because it's very much a game where shooting a lot of times in quick succession sometimes it's a good strategy, but very rarely. More often than not, it's about placing the right arrow in the right place. And it kind of means that the focus of this game is very much on hitting vulnerabilities, because the amount of time it takes for you to load another arrow and then pull the string before you can shoot again is long enough that if you're trying to go for body shots or something, it's usually not really going to be worth it. It's going to take a lot longer. On human enemies, you pretty much always want to go for headshots, because in comparison with how long it takes to fire every individual arrow, if you're going for body shots, it's almost like you're wasting damage. Against weaker enemies, you can kind of get away with it because it's only going to take 2 or 3 shots to the body to kill them, but otherwise it's if you're not getting headshots, you're kind of wasting your time. And this is especially true for mechanical enemies too. A lot of them have multiple weak points. They have armor all over their body, and you can knock that armor off, but the difference between landing the super sweet spot arrow at exactly the right place at exactly the right time and hitting some armor plate on the shoulder or something, it could be the difference between doing 1,000 damage and doing 2. So it's a very almost more thoughtful process. There isn't really a whole lot of just spray and pray kind of gameplay here. It's very much plan out what you're doing, have a strategy, go for the weak points. And that's kind of interesting. And the way the enemies are designed in this game is... It works really well along with it, because pretty much every enemy you have kind of multiple ways that you can go about it. Like I said, a lot of them have multiple weak points, but also you have the ability for a lot of them to shoot like their weapons kind of thing, so you can disable their most powerful attacks and stuff like that. So if we use the example of the Strider enemy, which is one of the very first enemies that you encounter very, very, very like right at the start of the game, they have a blaze canister on their back, which the game straight up tells you that if you shoot that off, it's going to do a large amount of damage, and it'll bring them down to pretty much no health. They're basically dead once you shoot it off, and that's pretty easy. But also, shooting off that blaze canister can be a little bit finicky, and like it's on their back, so if they're facing towards you, then it can be a little bit hard to hit, especially if you're like actually like engaged in combat. So the more you fight these enemies, eventually you'll probably realize like, oh hey, I can use my melee heavy attack to knock it over and just hit it with a critical attack, and that'll just kill it, and that's way easier. And that also creates like a trade-off, because you're not using up arrows to kill it that way, so you don't have to worry about crafting more arrows. But also you're sacrificing the fact that you're not dislodging the blaze canister, so you don't have that item that you can like scavenge. Which doesn't matter all that much. Blaze canisters are really easy to find, but it's kind of an example of how there's like a give and take of like different ways to go about things. And this kind of also leads to like the fact that Aloy has a spear. She can do melee attacks, which is not something that I even actually realized going into this game. The image of like Aloy as the bow user is like so much the thing that's out there that it didn't even occur to me that she had attacks other than that. And I think this game does a pretty good job of making it so that the melee attacks are useful, but like neither that or the bow are kind of like the good attack. Like there's a lot of enemies that you don't want to engage in melee range because like you're just going to get destroyed and not do anything. But there's also a lot of enemies, like I was saying with the Strider, where melee is actually very effective. So it's kind of like, in addition to each enemy having so many different ways to go about them, the melee is just kind of increasing your options, the amount of ways you can approach attacking an individual enemy. You also have the ability to do stealth kills and stuff like that. And I think stealth is done really well in this game too, because it's kind of like I was saying with options, where stealth is never like the only way to go. It's never really forced on you all that much, but it's also very much rewarded if you can do it well. So for example, if you have a mission where you're like infiltrating a bandit outpost, the way that human enemies work out compared to like the mechanical ones is they usually swarm you. They have like a whole bunch of them, and if you have like 7 guys on sniper tower shooting you with bows and like 3 guys up in your face trying to like bash your face in, then that's kind of hard. But if you go in all stealthy like, even if you just take out the guys on the sniper towers before alerting anybody, then that gives you a big advantage. You can go in kind of guns blazing, bow blazing, I guess, and it'll work, but taking the more stealthy approach to like thin out their numbers and stuff like that is pretty rewarding, I found. And it's pretty natural. Like they're pretty good about spreading out like the tall grass that you can hide in pretty much everywhere in the game. So it creates this pretty natural flow where if you are coming up to a challenge and you're like, okay, how do I approach this? Then you kind of have the time to assess the situation, find the right place to strike from, and build a plan. If that plan includes like laying traps, tripwires, mines, whatever, then all the better. And that's kind of an interesting theme of this game too. Maybe theme is the wrong word, but basically every enemy in this game is significantly easier to kill if you get the drop on it. So if the enemy is just kind of like wandering around and you get a free shot on their weak point or whatever, then you can basically disable it right away. Like, maybe you deal massive damage right off the bat so that they're pretty much dead by the time they know you exist. Or maybe you disable their most annoying weapon before they get to attack you or something. So getting the drop on an enemy is a really, really big deal. Whereas once they actually engage you and they're like up in your face trying to attack you, and they're trying to kill you, so like they're not gonna like expose their weak point. They're gonna try and like turn their back away from you or wherever their weak point is. So once they're actually fighting you, it becomes a lot harder to actually kill them. You have to get into like understanding their personality almost. You have to kind of just know when they're going to expose their weak point again. Maybe you know that like, oh well, if I roll over here at this specific time, I can get an angle on the thing on their hip or whatever. And it kind of, the whole thing really works together really nicely, because like it creates this situation where the more you fight an enemy, the more familiar you get with it, the easier it becomes. And it's really satisfying to have an enemy where it's like the first time you encounter it, it takes so much effort to kill it. You use up all of your arrows, you use up all your healing items, and then 20 hours later you run into them and you're just like, yep, I hit you here, I hit you here, I hit you here, and you're dead. And that's just really satisfying, because like it's not like you're killing this enemy super fast because you're dealing significantly more damage than you were at the beginning of the game. You might be dealing a little bit more, but not a lot. You're killing it not because Aloy got stronger. You're killing it easily because you got better at handling it. So all in all, I would say the combat in this game is really, really tight. It's very rewarding. It's very entertaining. There's a lot of cool like slides and jumps and whatever that you can do to make things really awesome looking and feeling, and it's all really great. It's not all sunshine and roses. I think probably one of my biggest complaints with this game on the whole is actually the melee combat in this game. I said that a lot of it was really good, and the options that it affords you is pretty handy, but it's also the case that it kind of feels like the game is trying to dick you over if an enemy actually gets into melee range. Which I guess you could potentially say is by design, because like I said, Aloy she's portrayed as a bow user. So maybe if an enemy gets up in your face, that's supposed to be a bad thing. But it feels kind of like bullshit to me. Some of it is just the fact that like the way enemies can tend to like dash around and all this stuff. If you have multiple enemies up in your face, it can get really hectic and hard to keep track of, and the camera is not always especially helpful. But a lot of it is just the fact that it feels like the game is giving the advantage to the enemy at that point. And a lot of that comes down to stuff like a lot of your moves don't feel like they have as much invincibility as they should. Your roll feels like it has like no invincibility whatsoever. It very clearly has a little bit, but like you get knocked out of your roll pretty easily, and that's really frustrating. Even like if you knock an enemy over and you go in for the critical hit, you don't have any invincibility during that animation, so you're just completely vulnerable while you're doing that. And even stuff like your enemy can very much knock you out of animations. So if you're going for like a heavy attack, that has a long lead up animation, and you can be hit out of that pretty easily. Whereas if your opponent is doing an animation, there's like basically no situation where you can knock them out of that. You even have odd situations where like attacks will line up just so that like you both get knocked back, but like only you take damage, your opponent doesn't take damage even though they got knocked back by your attack. It feels kind of scummy. So when you're face to face, it really feels like you are at a disadvantage. Which, like I said, maybe that's by design, but it feels like bullshit. And just beyond the actual combat in this game, I think one of the big strengths of Zero Dawn is the fact that it offers a fair amount of variety. You're kind of always doing something different. Sometimes you're fighting human enemies, sometimes you're fighting mechanical enemies. Those feel very different. Sometimes you're just running around hunting stuff. Sometimes you're spending an expended amount of time just talking to people, getting quests, advancing the plot, and that's all done pretty well. It's got like a Mass Effect style dialogue system, which It doesn't have quite the same level of like consequences and all that stuff, but it's cool. The dialogue and the scenes and all that stuff is handled very well. Sometimes you're like infiltrating enemy bases, like I said, like the bandit outposts and stuff like that. Sometimes you're like spelunking like ancient ruins or whatever. And some of them almost feel like straight up dungeons. So there's a lot of like different things that you end up doing. So it never really feels like any one particular part of the game gets old. So that's pretty cool. I really appreciate that. And kind of in addition to that is the fact that like for pretty much the entire game, you always feel like there's something that you're looking for. Like the way that the economy and stuff like that works out in this game is it very much shifts as the game goes on. When you start off, like you use scraps to craft arrows, which scraps are also the currency in this game. So at the beginning, you're literally scrounging around and you're wondering like, okay, can I afford to buy this thing? Like, am I going to be able to craft enough arrows to kill stuff if I buy this thing? And kind of by the end of the game, you're like, okay, well, I need one raccoon skin in order to craft the ultimate ammo pouch for my sharpshooter bow or whatever. So you're just looking for like one specific thing, but you're still you've got your eyes open when you're kind of out in the wilderness. You're always looking for medicine to fill your medicine pouch. So it's kind of interesting just in that you kind of always have a goal, even though that goal shifts a lot over time. I will say, though, that as you get towards the end of the game, maybe this is more true for me than some, because I 100%ed the game, so I play a lot more of the game than a lot of people would, but towards the end I got to a point where I'd maxed out my level, so I didn't really have a whole lot of reason to kill more enemies, and I had, like, more shards than God, so like I was not hurting for resources anymore, and that was kind of that was a little bit annoying, because at that point it kind of felt like there wasn't a whole lot of reason to roam around the open world anymore. I was just kind of fast traveling from point to point, progressing the story, and that kind of has its own appeal, but it felt a little disappointing I was basically disincentivized from actually engaging enemies in combat at that point, because I didn't care what they dropped. I didn't need experience, so it was literally like a straight loss if I was actually to fight anything. And that kind of sucks. I'll also say, kind of on the topic of the open world, I guess, is the climbing in this game kind of annoys me. It's basically like Uncharted style climbing, where you can only climb where the game tells you to climb, basically. They do a pretty good job of basically marking things that you can grab onto, but there's usually some kind of like yellow bit to them, whether it's like yellow ropes or like a yellowish tinge to the rock or something. But they're not always easy to find, and it's kind of annoying when you get to a point where it's like, okay, I don't know where to go, so I guess I'm just going to look around and hope that I see something yellowish. And that to me is pretty lame. I dislike that. And the way that the world is laid out, it's kind of frustrating, because it's like Aloy can do these like incredible feats of athleticism and climb up these like sheer mountain faces and all this stuff, but it's like you have a little hill that's like slightly taller than your shins, and you can't jump up that high. It's like you literally can only climb where the game tells you to climb, and that can get pretty annoying, especially if you like fall off of something. A lot of times if you do that, it's really annoying to get back up, because sometimes that means going around like an entire like cliff face or whatever. It's actually kind of funny comparing this game to Breath of the Wild, which I've been playing now that I'm done with Zero Dawn. Because like Breath of the Wild almost has like the opposite problem, where it's like Link will like grab onto anything and everything, and he'll climb up anything you want him to climb up. Maybe he doesn't have enough stamina to get up it, and he climbs like super slow, but like if you want to go there, you can probably go there. You can probably climb up that mountain face eventually. Whereas Aloy is like the exact opposite. It's kind of interesting. And I guess kind of like complaining about climbing aside, I should probably talk a little bit about the story of the game. So I mentioned in my video on narrative that Aloy is like an outcast in this game and kind of grows up in seclusion away from all the people and tribes and whatever of this place. And it's very much a like one thing leads to another type deal. But I would say that this game does a pretty good job of handling its its story. Like I said in my previous video, like a lot of it is they do a good job of communicating their narrative to the player, but it's also like the story of this game is fairly predictable. Like if you take a minute to think about, this is a world that's like tribal, like undeveloped humanity, and yet you have all these machines, and like Aloy has a focus thing that she wears on the side of her face that it's like ancient technology that lets her like scan things. It's basically like a scanner. And you kind of think about the way these things work out, and you can probably imagine where the plot for this game goes. But it's interesting the way it gets there, and the way that the scenes play out is pretty entertaining. Information is doled out at a really good pace, so that if you want to learn more, you can jump from point to point and learn it pretty quickly. I was pretty thrilled with like the way I approach games is very much do all the quests and then progress with the story. So by the time I was done doing all the quests, I was able to just kind of splurge on all the story for the last several hours, and that was really fun. Just kind of like, oh my god, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? I probably know what's going to happen next, but like I want to see it happen. And it's, you know, the characters are pretty entertaining. Some of them are better than others, I would say. There's at least one character that I was not really a fan of. And they do a pretty good job of building the emotional attachment to the characters and the world, I guess is a way of putting it. So by the end of the game, like I was very much invested in what's going on, and like I said, even though you can tell where the plot is going, especially the further that you get, and yet the scenes feel impactful. It's very much a story about kind of like technology versus nature, and that's a theme that like I always really enjoy having a theme like that in games. So I think this game executes on it very well, and so I appreciated that a lot. But anyways, I think I probably rambled about this enough. There's probably more things that I could talk about, but these are all the things that I found especially thought-provoking about this game. Overall, like it's a very, very, very high-quality experience, I would say. There's definitely some nitpicks about it. There's definitely some points in the game that I found frustrating. There's definitely some aspects of the game's design that I found frustrating. But overall, it's just a really satisfying experience. It's a very fun video game. I haven't enjoyed just kind of roaming around, just kind of like doing stuff in a video game quite this much for, I would say, quite a while. So if you haven't played Horizon Zero Dawn, hopefully I've convinced you that you should at this point. And yeah, that's about it for me. So I will catch you later.